Hi everyone and welcome back to ThursDev. My name is Luke, and today we're going to pick up where we left off last week with a continuation on the topic of feedback loops and their impact on game progression design. We already talked at length about positive feedback loops and how they create what's essentially a spiral of player rewards that keep people engaged and moving in a perpetual cycle between interlocked mechanics. But no talk on the subject of feedback loops would be complete without exploring a little bit more detail into the other side of the feedback coin, negative feedback. Something I didn't touch on in the first feedback loop video was that positive feedback isn't always a positive thing, which is to say, though it's an engagement mechanic that facilitates progression, it also exists to allow itself to grow, and when left unchecked, a positive feedback loop can rapidly get out of hand and become unmanageable. For an example, let's look at the kill loot buy cycle that I talked about in relation to positive feedback loops. Killing leads to gaining loot, leads to the ability to buy gear, which leads to better killing, which leads to better loot, and so on. But if this cycle goes uninterrupted, the power spiral would mean that eventually the player would become so unmanageably powerful that, conversely, the game would become boring, and they'd finish much too quickly. It's in this case that it's in our best interest to apply negative feedback. A brief explanation of negative feedback. Firstly, it stands to be mentioned that in the same way that a positive feedback loop isn't always a positive thing because it isn't inherently good, a negative feedback loop isn't inherently bad. Simply put, where positive feedback is designed to push a player forward by enhancing and feeding mechanics, negative feedback is designed to throttle mechanics back, provide managed friction, and in doing so create an entertaining play experience. When applied in the right doses, negative feedback provides the challenge necessary to make a game fun. In the RPG, this manifests in the rising strength and new abilities of encountered enemies, the rarity of valuable loot, or the cost of desired gear. By applying this friction, the upward progression caused by the positive feedback is counteracted, and though there is by and large a net even level of challenge, the game feels like it's genuinely creating forward momentum. Negative feedback also exists as a counterbalance to the effects of positive feedback, creating an unfair advantage in many cases, especially in competitive games. Take racing games, for example. In a race, once the person in first place reaches their maximum speed, assuming they don't make mistakes, there will be essentially no way for other players to get past them. This means that they'll be stuck in their position throughout the race and may even quit before the race is done if they can't get to first place beyond the other person. The game's first priority is to provide a challenge, but not insurmountable frustration to the player, so negative feedback is applied in a number of possible ways. The player is given an item that temporarily gives them a burst of speed, potentially pushing them forward in the ranks, which is an active use of feedback, or perhaps more subtly, the cars in front of the player begin to perform less perfectly. They make mistakes, or in some cases even their maximum speed is throttled down just enough to allow the player to catch up with them. This doesn't necessarily work in player versus player, but in an AI game it's a frequently used tactic. This is colloquially known as rubber banding, and is one of the more famous applications of negative feedback in gaming. Rubber banding is similarly applied when the player has too commanding a lead. Other cars begin to perform better, move faster, and start to get access to items designed to slow the lead player down, or to catch up to them, while the person in first gets fewer items that help them maintain their lead. As the first job of a game is to entertain, it behooves the designer to put some method in place for the player to get ahead when they're falling behind, just as much as it should attempt to reel the player in when they move forward too quickly. Neither case is really desirable because one causes undue frustration and the other leads to boredom. This can be a difficult equilibrium to achieve, however. Negative feedback, when applied with a heavy hand, can also lead to a game becoming far too easy or too difficult, depending on the way that it's used. If every race feels like the tortoise and the hare, where the race is essentially thrown by the computer, our hare in this case, because the player was too far behind, it'll quickly become uninteresting. Conversely, negative feedback that inhibits play too much, or cause a positive feedback loop to need to loop inward on itself too much, can also lead to grind, as described in the previous video. With some notable exceptions, the best feedback loops, both positive and negative, are those that are opaque enough that the player barely notices them, if at all. Gentle nudges by the game to ensure that the player is never feeling too frustrated or that their hand is being held too much. Rarely should a negative feedback be the catalyst to lead a player to victory or defeat, but a subtle contributor, Though it feels like it ends up with a fairer game, inherently feedback loops really aren't fair. But then again, games aren't meant to be completely fair. They certainly can be. A card or dice game frequently is fair when played analog, but the results are always, by design, completely random. But randomness is not really truly fun for players who want to experience a video game purely for entertainment. True randomness, at times, can even feel like it's less fair, weighted in favor of the game thanks to good old confirmation bias. This is the reason that even games that rely very heavily on RNG, that's random number generation if you didn't watch my video about speedrun appreciation, still tends to skew results in favor of the player. One game that applies negative feedback in favor of their player in this manner is the recent XCOM 2 and its aim assist mechanics. If you play the game on Legendary exclusively, you probably haven't experienced this because aim assist is disabled on that difficulty, but in normal and veteran most noticeably, the game tracks hits and misses and looks how much of an advantage or disadvantage the player is faced with, and purposely alters the results of its randomly generated numbers to compensate. The values controlling this can be found within XCOM 2's XCOM game core.ini files if you care to look. In there exists a variable called aim assist that modifies the roll made internally by the game in the player's favor if luck hasn't been going their way, or if they've just chosen a lower difficulty setting. Assuming that the attempted shot already has at least a 50-50 shot to hit, it applies modifiers as thus. If the players miss too many times, a miss streak chance adjustment adds 10 to the next shot, hopefully making the shot more likely to hit, and even in the case of the lowest difficulty, applies a -10 modifier if the player's hitting too often. If the player's team loses a soldier and is reduced to 4 or fewer members, they gain a 10 or 15% adjustment in their favor, as well as applying a -10 to incoming alien shots that further are reduced by 10 for each shot that still connects, effectively making each soldier in a compromised team harder to hit and better at aiming. And before any modifier is even made, the game's also already adding a 20 or 10% modifier on every shot rolled for the player's characters based on their difficulty level. The chances to hit aren't displayed any differently, and to the player the negative is still going to far outshine the positive, but this subtle massaging of the random numbers is a shining example of how games apply friction to game mechanics in the player's favor. In some cases to make it fun, and in some cases to make it feel less weighted in the game's favor. Because fair doesn't always feel fair. And that's what negative feedback exists to mitigate. Pure reliance on a game's base unadulterated mechanics to provide player enjoyment is in theory a good idea, but with the exception of the truly hardcore, people generally get their enjoyment not from playing only, but from often winning a narrow victory, and that's what should be facilitated, when appropriate. And that's it for today. Hopefully this was educational, if not entertaining, and I sincerely hope that I'll get the chance to see all of you around here again very soon. We create game development theory videos like this one every Thursday, as well as game discussion video podcasts every Sunday. If you'd like to keep up with our videos, click that subscribe button and YouTube will do the rest. Otherwise, thank you as always for dropping by. I'm always glad to see people enjoying my videos, and I'll see you tomorrow or any other day that you care to watch. Take care.